Hi, my name is Brandon Dixon,
I'm Benjamin Powell.
and today we're going to be going over our threat hunting workshop content where we explore the methodologies, data sets, and how to perform an investigation and hunt down threats.
Let's begin.
So we're going to begin with a threat analysis lifecycle, and the first part of the lifecycle is really surface suspicious. And what that means is we're trying to find something on our network or maybe from a partner that we don't really know too much about. We don't know whether it's good or whether it's bad.
So what devices are gathering that information internally that we can use to bring that suspicious indicator into life?
Well, in some networks, we have things like intrusion detection systems or intrusion prevention systems. We may have proxy logs or web server logs. And some of those devices might have signatures and monitors in place. Or if you're an advanced organization, you might even have your own in-house data collection, your ability to mine all of the data that you have internally. Depending on how connected you are inside of the industry, you might actually have a number of different paid feeds or free feeds that you're collecting from the open source that can help you surface suspicious. So these might be things like threat feeds from some sort of open source provider like Firehole, for instance, where they aggregate a number of feeds together, and then you can pump that information into your own data and look for the intersection between matches on a known bad list and then events that are occurring within your network.
So like an IP address internally that's talking to something outside that's on a known bad list.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And so just because that ends up on a bad list, it doesn't necessarily mean that what we're dealing with is malicious. It does take some time for us to actually go through and see, is it malicious? Something that was malicious today may not be malicious tomorrow. And so it requires us to apply our analytical rigor over on that data to really figure out whether or not it's something that is bad.
Like an IP address that might change because it's dynamic.
Yeah.
And it was bad today, but tomorrow it's associated with a good domain.
Yeah, and with the advent of cloud providers such as Amazon or DigitalOcean or any of these VPSs, attackers can spin up systems very quickly. They can conduct their phishing attacks or their malicious attacks, and then they can simply remove them. That IP address is then freed back up into a pool that anyone else could get assigned to. So at this point, we've got something that's been surfaced as suspicious. We need to figure out more about it. We want to collect as much data as possible to help inform the decision that we're ultimately trying to make. Is this good or is it bad?
So where should they be collecting from? Just the edge, or is it between the different routed boundaries from the web, app, database, internal network? Where should they be focusing, collecting data?
Really, it should be trying to focus as many places as possible. So from a risk IQ perspective, we're going to be focusing on the external internet-facing data, whereas if it's on your own network and you're monitoring, let's say, NetFlow information or firewall logs or proxy logs, you'll have coverage there. And so what we like to tell people is you want to make sure that you have a 360-degree view that you're able to get data from as many sources as possible. And really that's important simply because in the event that you experience a breach, the external data is going to be really helpful in understanding and enriching maybe what the attacker's infrastructure looked like. But if that attacker is now laterally moving within your network or changing infrastructure or even becoming an employee of your organization, you need to make sure that you have your own data and visibility into that.
And as the attack changes over time, if we can find that indicator that was communicating out and showing all the infrastructure that's being used, we can see how that attack might change over time and be able to prevent it potentially.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, at this stage, having that internal data is extremely important. Having the external data is important as well. But you also can't lose sight of the fact that you have peers and other industry groups that you could work with. So I know, for instance, that I've worked with the FS-ISAC.
And I've worked with InfraGuard.
Yeah. So we're able to leverage these organizations where it's sometimes peers and it's part of the same industry, or just folks that are very interested in having good security posture and good defense. And we can work together to essentially exchange information, attacks that we're seeing that they may not see, and so on. And that allows us to kind of help look inside of our network to figure out if we're dealing with something that maybe our detection systems miss.
Yeah, and I've worked with projects within Passive Total to be able to have peers from outside be able to look at the the investigation that we're conducting.
Yeah, that's a great point. That is kind of what I would consider almost like an open source intelligence source, where just like I could put a piece of infrastructure into Google and run a search to see what results come back. If I'm using something like RiskIQ's Passive Total, and that even the free version, as I'm pivoting around on a piece of infrastructure, if there's a public project that someone else has created, maybe an industry peer or an individual, that information will come associated up with the search results that I have, and I can investigate that further. Okay, so now we have all of this data, and you'll note in the slide that I put collect data. I didn't put collect intelligence. And so it's at this point where we've got something that we know is suspicious. We're not quite sure if it's good or bad. Should we spin up a response team? Is it false positive? We've collected as much data as possible, and now we want to make an assessment. We want to take all of that information, aggregate together, and try to tell a story as to what might have occurred here. Are we dealing with an attack? Are we dealing with a false positive? And that's at that point where we're transforming that data into raw intelligence. And so here, this is where you want to leverage your subject matter expertise, and that takes a while to develop. When I was first starting out as an analyst, I was always amazed that I would talk with peers in the industry, and I would say, hey, I'm looking at something, I think this is totally bad, and then one of my buddies would tell me, oh, you're looking at a hosting provider. Right. It's a shared infrastructure, it has common overlap all over the place, how could you not see this? And for me, it was discouraging because I was trying to apply all this data analysis and collecting as much information as possible, and it was very time consuming. Right. But I didn't know what to actually look for. And I think over time, I just developed this sense of seeing patterns within the data.
It's see that needle in the haystack of all the noise and pinpointing and saying, okay, I'm going to focus right here because this doesn't look right.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's one of those things that as an analyst, you can train yourself to do simply by starting with something you know is bad and looking at data and how that data appears and any patterns that may show up or manifest inside of that data. So if we know that something's bad and then we see common patterns on bad infrastructure, then we can start to train ourselves that in the future when we see those patterns, we might be dealing with something bad.
Like a certificate associated with malware.
Yeah.
Then if we see that certificate being used on a different host, then we can say, hey, that doesn't look right.
Sure. Or one of the great examples I like to use is sometimes threat actors will actually take a domain that they're using for command and control for malicious purposes, and when they're done conducting operations for the day, they'll shut it off by parking that domain on an IP address that doesn't actually route to anything on the internet. So an example of that might be 127.0.0.1, which is your local loopback address. And so you might ask yourself, well, why would someone do that? Well, there really is no good reason why. So in the event that you're ever looking at infrastructure, and for me personally, when I see a non-routable address appear associated to a domain, I tell myself, I'm probably dealing with something at least suspicious because that's not a normal behavior.
And then how are we detecting that non-routable IP that's out on the internet? Is that through the DNS or name servers, or how are we getting that?
So that in that case would be something like passive DNS or performing an active resolution, which we'll discuss later in the course. But what's really important here to take away is that there's just patterns that may exist. Things that if you're asking yourself, like, man, that looks really strange, right. Like, is that normal behavior? Then chances are it may not be normal. And that helps to make the assessment. And I think what's important with this threat analysis lifecycle is that you want to have a process in place that is first surfacing something that's suspicious, making sure that you're trained in collecting data. And this may change over time. You may get more data sources, you may lose some data sources. But ultimately, you want to make an assessment. You don't want to enter a state where you're just never doing anything, because that wouldn't help anyone.
Right. And later, when we get into projects, we can show how you can look at the history of the project for somebody who's a junior analyst to see how this investigation progressed over time.
Yep.
So they can learn as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the philosophies that we have at RiskIQ that's really interesting is that you can't avoid interacting with the internet. And so we have 5 different steps in which we kind of quantify like how this can be beneficial to us. So the first is any action on the internet emits signals. So for example, you and I are sitting together right now in this room, part of RiskIQ's network. And we're emitting signals by being on that network. Both my computer, your computer.
Our phones, yeah.
Yeah, our phones being in the same room. we have now been co-located in the same place for however long we're going to be together.
Mm-hmm.
And so the second part of that is, we're emitting signals. So these are going out into the ether. Maybe they're being recorded on the internet, or they're just local inside the room. Signals are largely ephemeral, and they're going to go unnoticed unless someone's listening.
Mm-hmm.
So in the case of us being in the same room, if no one's logging our internet traffic as we egress out to the internet,
Mm-hmm.
then no one will know that we were actually together, that both of our machines were on the same network.
Mm-hmm.
However, and this is point 3, if the signals have been captured, then in theory they could expose the stages, elements, or infrastructure associated with an attack. So let's say, for example, that I'm planning something bad. And that, now, and people are watching me, they're recording me, they know that I'm a bad actor. Well, all the signals that I'm emitting are now being collected and analyzed by these folks to make sure that I don't do anything, that they can get it one step ahead of me. Well, now you and I are in the same location. We're emitting signals together, and if they're being captured, in theory now, there's an association where
I'm associated with a known bad, so then I could potentially be bad.
Exactly.
Or if we went to a restaurant and we both use a debit or credit card, they can say we were both at a restaurant because they can look at that record.
Exactly.
If they had it. But if I paid cash, then no one would know that I went there.
Yeah, so signals, they're everywhere. And what's important to note here is that those exposed signals, us being together, for instance, could literally destroy an operation or really make it inefficient. And so if you were to leave here today, and let's say that you were that I was being monitored, someone would know now to monitor you. And if you were planning something bad, now you would potentially be thwarted. Now, obviously, we're not doing anything bad here, but the point of what we're trying to make is that signals are occurring all the time, and a lot of it happens just by the nature of the internet itself, being on the internet.
So a website may be pulling an image from Facebook,
yeah,
or sending information to Google Analytics to say, this is my traffic that's happening.
Yeah.
All that are the signals that we're talking about, that type of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of those are, they're not readily apparent to you. You may not realize that a Google Analytics tracker is present on a web page when you're viewing it, simply because it may not tell you.
Mm-hmm.
Another good example is that, if I'm going to send a phishing email, the act of actually sending the email itself is a pretty overt action. I'm pretty aware of as to what's going on. I can tangibly see I've created an email, I've hit the send button, I have expectations that will get delivered to you on the other end.
Mm-hmm.
However, behind the scenes, when I hit that send button, there's an IP address that's getting associated where the network traffic is leaving from, and that's egressing through a network and maybe going through an autonomous system.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's turning into different packets that get routed out on the internet, which then ultimately land through the email provider, which was specifically picked, and then is filtered through your email information, etc. So a lot of hidden signals there too, not just necessarily the overt ones.
So the internal and the external merging together to give you the complete picture.
Yeah, and I think what's important here is that last point, number 5, that if we have enough signals and if we're able to expose these elements of attacks, even before they're an attack, then we can essentially destroy operations and waste money of the adversary and the attacker. And the more money that they have to spend redoing their infrastructure, the more likely that we're able to stop them from conducting attacks as frequently. And another example I'd like to point out here, I think is just interesting, is that in the analyst world or the research community, there's often a desire to not want to burn infrastructure or not want to out a particular actor. And because in doing so, that actor may change and they may lose visibility. Even in cases where we're burning infrastructure, that in of itself is leading to signals being created. For instance, if we go and we out some sort of government operation, all of their infrastructure, their domains, their IP addresses, their SSL certificates, everything they're using, they may frantically go and register a whole bunch of new infrastructure so they can continue their operations.
So just that influx of new infrastructure being purchased and stood up online and put in place could be an indicator on its own.
Yeah. And when you're doing something very quickly, you might be more prone to making a mistake. Mm-hmm. And that mistake could be a signal that we capture and then use to our advantage.
Very good.
Okay, so we talk about the value of signals and how they can really expose elements or something as part of an attack and really help us get a handle on what's going on. So Risk IQ specializes in collecting signals, and we do this through a number of different means, but we're collecting a lot of information as depicted on the slide there in a number of different hexagons. These data sets are just some of the ones that we have. There is more, and it's always growing, but it's important to know these are some of the signals that we'll be working with in the workshop.
So why is it so important to use like a global proxy network to be able to do your traffic when we're collecting this data? Why is that important?
Yeah, so having proxies all over the world and functioning for us to have our traffic egress through is important because some attackers or the more sophisticated actors may choose to only deliver their malicious payload to a particular region. They may only look for browsers that are running a certain language pack, for instance. Mm-hmm. And if we don't have a presence in that country, we may not actually see the malicious event taking place.
Or the threat actor might say, we're blocking all traffic from Risk IQ's IP space,
yeah.
so you can't come at all. Or the victim's traffic, so they can't go research if that's really an attack or not.
Yeah, so I mean, being a security company, it can be challenging because we end up on the radar of attackers. People want to get past our defenses. Mm-hmm. They don't want to emit signals that we're capturing. And so having those globally placed sensors all over the world and frequently rotating them is extremely important. It's also important too that we're not only just egressing through different locations, but we're also instrumenting pretty powerful tools to collect information as well. And so our headless web crawlers, what we typically call virtual users, mm-hmm. are conducting billions of requests a day. And much like you go and surf the internet with your browser, our headless web crawlers are doing the same thing. They're collecting all of the information as if they were a user in a browser, including clicking around, scrolling, etc.
Acting like what our parents would do.
Yeah, clicking around, maybe clicking on links they shouldn't be doing, getting redirected and potentially served malware. The benefit that we have there is that this is all automated. It can be done at scale, mm-hmm. and we don't have to worry about getting infected with malware because these aren't running on real full-fledged hosts.
So they're acting like any type of device and operating system coming from different points of presence around the world. So it's acting like the intended victim. So then it can see what's happening out there.
Yeah, if you pair the concept of our web crawler and our ability to tune them to make it look like anything that we want, along with our globally placed sensors, we really have a powerful capability there. I think what else is important here too is that if we just simply relied on us performing the crawls and going out and seeking things online, mm-hmm. we may miss a lot. And so we've actually gone through and instrumented ourselves to perform regular internet scans on a routine basis. And we're looking at all of the IPv4 space, scanning for over 100 ports being open and collecting the banners and headers from that. And not to mention collecting some open source intelligence results and mining that information as well.
So with that information and linking that together, we have a nice map of the internet, or a nice signal map of what's out there on the internet.
Yeah, and what's important here too is that you'll notice we have a number of different signals at our disposal, and that's simply because actors evolve over time. One day they may be using their own registered infrastructure, but then we might burn their operations or expose some of the elements, mm-hmm. and they may choose to go to a third-party cloud provider. Now, what's the problem with a cloud provider?
Well, the infrastructure is constantly changing, evolving. The IP space, they can spin it up, spin it down, move it all around, and it's hard to track.
Yeah, it's difficult to track. So a data set like passive DNS may become less useful for us. And so that's why we had to expand or continue to always expand our data sets and look for new signals. And so where we might lose out on the passive DNS connection between finding new websites, we might have crawled that infrastructure and found that there was a unique tracker or cookie that was being deployed on the web page that allows us to make a connection to that infrastructure.
So as the infrastructure moves and they still have that same tracker, that cookie or analytic code, then we can link that infrastructure and say, hey, it's the same or it's associated with it.
Absolutely. The point here that we're trying to get is signals are important, and we want as many of them as possible, because the more that we have, that means that the higher fidelity connections we can make.
The better the decision you can make to say if it's really bad or not.
Absolutely. Okay, so we got all these signals. We know they're super important, and if we're using Risk IQ, we have a vast amount of things that we can work with. These signals ultimately inform a process that we've labeled threat infrastructure analysis. And so the wordy definition that we've come up with is that it's a research process that leverages the inherent connected nature of the internet to identify related entities. It's absolutely a mouthful. We've iterated on this definition a number of times. I really do think it's the best one we can come up with.
But it's the signals, right?
It's the connected nature of the signals.
Yeah.
The way that the internet functions, it happens in this inherent way. Domains are going to have an IP address where they're being hosted, an email may have registered them, etc. There's things that just take place that connect these different data sets together.
And no one can avoid it. It's every website has to play by the same rules to be on the internet, or it doesn't function. You can't get there.
Exactly. And so why is this process important? Why do we have a methodology around threat infrastructure analysis? Well, what we've observed over the years of doing this work is that these operators or people that are conducting attacks are humans. They're going to make mistakes. We're all creatures of habit. And so what we've identified is that infrastructure is not some sort of infinite resource. It's finite in the sense that there's only so many IP addresses, or there's only so many domains that you can get, or there's only so many networks you can interact with.
So if the bad actor is going to go buy a new domain, he might reuse the address or the telephone number or the email address associated with that. So because it's something that he might have scripted or have an account to verify the information with.
Yeah, that's correct. Or in some cases, we'll notice that some hosting providers actually allow the malicious activity to occur. They kind of turn a blind eye to what's occurring. And so you might find that certain registrars or hosting providers will frequently come up when you identify malicious activity. And that's simply because these actors have favored a particular hosting provider because of the lack of takedown that's taking place. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of potential reuse here. Again, signals, overlap. And you can chain all of these different data sets and the connections between them together to help you surface new leads inside of an investigation. And that becomes really, really helpful when you're taking that suspicious event that may have occurred, collecting the data and trying to make an assessment.
So the threat infrastructure analysis is a foundation to be able to take these signals and make a determination.
Absolutely. And what's nice about this is that coming from a background, some folks might be more technical than others, but what I particularly like about the threat infrastructure analysis methodology is that it's a repeatable process that's pretty easy to begin understanding. The only barrier to entry here is having some understanding of the protocols of the internet and the data sets that we're going to be working with, which is the purpose of this workshop.
Right.
So by the end of this workshop, not only will you understand threat infrastructure analysis and the methodology, but you'll be able to instantly start applying it inside of your organization or when conducting just research on your own. Okay, so we got threat infrastructure analysis. We have this long, wordy definition about how everything's connected. Mm-hmm. And so this is an example here that we're showing that's an infrastructure chain is what we'll call it. And so you'll remember that we have these hexagons. They're representing data points in this particular case. And what we're doing is we're forming a chain. So each one of those hexagons is a data point, and then the relation or proximity to other hexagons is the connection that might be made.
Okay.
So if we start in the top left here and we have that IP address, that's connected through a domain because the domain itself is resolving to the IP. Now maybe that domain was registered with a particular email. And that email was then connected to another domain. It was also registered with the same email. Mm-hmm. And maybe that domain's inside of an open source intelligence report. What we're trying to do here is essentially the Kevin Bacon effect for the internet. We want to be able to leverage these inherent relationships between the data sets to form these chains, because if we're starting with an IP address, we can then go through the different connections on the chain and identify something that we may not have seen before.
So this is like where the internal and the external come together. So internally you might have seen a compromised machine trying to phone home someplace out on the internet. And that's an IP address. And you don't know anything about it other than the IP address.
Yeah.
And then from that, you can see how that links together and all the infrastructure that might be involved in that particular attack, even though you had one indicator only.
Yeah, what's beautiful about this process is that you can start with one indicator and quickly balloon that into maybe several indicators, tens, sometimes hundreds of indicators, depending on how sloppy the actors are. So picking a more concrete example inside of this infrastructure chain, if we want to analyze the layers here, I picked that IP example before, which is still present on this example, but what we're looking at is a slightly different perspective now. So in this case, we're starting with a piece of malware. Maybe
Okay.
we found this on our network. It was a file that one of our antivirus agents hit. And maybe there was a signature running on my machine and it said, hey, this file is doing something shady. You need to check it out. Well, if we're using the signals that are available to us, at layer 2, we might have a hard-coded IP address and an SSL certificate that are part of the malware that make it up.
Okay.
And at layer 3, that SSL certificate that was hard-coded in the malware might have a domain associated with it. And in fact, it might have been hosted on an IP address somewhere that's different than the command and control IP address that we originally discovered in the malware. And then at layer 4, that domain that we got from the SSL certificate may in fact be hosting a web page. And that web page might include an analytical tracker like Google Analytics that then gives us more connections. Or it might have an older SSL certificate associated with it. Or that IP address that we found hosting that SSL certificate might have another domain that we did not see. And so what we're trying to impart here with this infrastructure chain concept is that you can build upon all these different layers, these different signals and the connections that they have in order to form new insights and really to break open an investigation.
So this might be something where you see one piece of the iceberg, but there's this piece underneath that you don't know about that you need to be aware of, so then you can put the defenses in place to prevent future attacks or stop the attack from migrating and changing over time.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect analogy. The iceberg there is where you're maybe seeing the tip of the attack, but in reality, there's much more going on. And we're talking about this as if the attack is ongoing. Maybe we're being in a reactive position. But what's important to note here is that this methodology and what we're talking about and chaining to all these different data sets together can actually be applied in a proactive manner, which we'll go into in some of the benefits. So no methodology is going to be perfect, and there's caveats to threat infrastructure analysis, just like there is anything else. And I have 3 main points that we like to cover when introducing this methodology, especially to newer analysts. The first being that all data sources have a bias. There might be gaps in collection, specific processes that people follow and how they get their data, time zone skews, etc. There could be a number of things.
Mm-hmm. So what are some examples like a drive-by malware? Might be through an ad. So if we scanned it and we found that malware because that ad was playing, if we went back to the site a week later, it might not be there, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great example. Another one could be the fact that when we do our routine internet scans, we can't scan the internet every single second that it's changing. And so scanning the internet one day may reveal open ports on a particular server, and then the next day they might be shut off. So there's always some sort of gap in the collection.
So when we're scanning, it's not always consistent the same time every day, every single day, because to have that infrastructure, I don't think anybody could be able to have that.
Yeah, it'd be tough to scale it.
So like even the threat actor, we have to keep them on their toes when you're doing these scans, because if you're always doing every Tuesday at 3 p.m., then they could change their website that when we go and scan them, that it looks normal.
Yep, absolutely. And so what's also important to note here as well is that sometimes you'll identify cases where there's no information at all. Now, keeping in mind that there's gaps in collection, it's not that something didn't exist. It just may not have been collected. The signals were probably there, but no one actually captured them.
So the phishing website maybe was up for an hour, and by the time we went to scan it, it was already shut down, for example.
Yep. And so we are seeing that with actors kind of taking note of the fact that if they're able to do something quickly, that they may not be discovered. And so they might register infrastructure, put it on a third-party host, run their operations for 1 hour, 2 hours, shut it down, and start it up again.
But that's an indicator, because of the way that they do it, that we could see that with the signal, the domain being purchased, the being hosted and shut down. So just a newly observed domain might be an indicator that might be suspicious.
Yeah, and if they're changing every hour, then that's going to have a pattern of changing an IP address every hour, which is not normal behavior for legitimate infrastructure. So the next one that we have here is that a connection is not necessarily equivalent to a solid analytical lead. And what I mean by this is if you're let's say you're looking at your web server logs at your company, and you see an IP address in there that's maybe conducting some sort of attack, or they're trying to conduct an attack on your infrastructure. And that IP address is associated back to Russia. doesn't necessarily mean that someone in Russia is trying to attack you. And in fact, it may just be some sort of proxy or compromised IP address. It could be a legitimate piece of infrastructure that the actors are using to obscure who they actually are.
Could be your mother getting infected with malware and the threat actors proxying to their machine to go do their attack.
Yeah, no doubt. Now, here's the thing. You see an IP address that's associated with Russia in your logs, and you're a banking institution, and it could be an anomaly. But if you're part of the Ukraine separatist forces, at that point in time, you might want to take a little bit more consideration as to what you're looking at. But what we're trying to say here is that having a connection, that single point, is not necessarily indicative of the person that's trying to attack you or that you're dealing with something malicious.
And that's where you need to look at the complete signals and look at the complete picture before you make your determination.
Yeah, you want to use the experience that you have. You want to evaluate the results. You want to ensure that you're collecting as much data as possible. Now, for me personally, I like to have at least 3 points of proof, 3 connections out through different data sources to help back up the claim that I have. The last caveat of threat infrastructure analysis is really that the process itself is not really static. Keeping in mind that the internet is going to be changing all the time, that infrastructure can change at any moment, us doing our investigation today may yield a certain amount of results. But if the actors come through and change their infrastructure afterwards, if we come back and look at it tomorrow, we might be dealing with completely new connections or new indicators of compromise that we may want to feed back into our processes, our systems. So unlike a case where we might take a piece of malware and write a report about all of its capabilities, that's very static. With infrastructure, it requires you to constantly go back and keep up to it, which can be difficult. So you need to have a way to constantly monitor all of these different data sets and in particular, the indicators that you found interesting.
So how it evolves over time, how it grows or shrinks or changes, because once something gets burned, it might swap completely, and you need to be able to then find those connections and try to link it back together.
Yeah, and there's some cases where, I've been part of investigations that have ran for nearly 2 years of starting with one piece of information, expanding it, having someone burn that, finding a new linkage, and then keeping it. You just follow that process down. And it can take a long time to keep up with these actors, especially since they're motivated typically through financing, through financial means in order to get money, or if it's a government or state-sponsored work, it's part of their job to do this.
So some of the ways that we'll get to later will be like projects and how I can put these indicators in and tell it to monitor.
Yeah.
So then I'm not constantly rerunning these queries every single day to see if there's changes. The system will do it for me, and as the data comes in that matches a change into those indicators, I will then see it immediately.
Yeah, we'll definitely be covering that and how we can use the platform that RiskIQ's created, Passive Total, to essentially help accelerate our data collection, but also help us do the continuous monitoring aspect as well. Okay, so at this point, we've introduced the threat analysis lifecycle. We've covered a bit about signals, their importance, and now we've gone through and showed like some infrastructure chaining. Why would I want to apply this methodology, this concept of threat infrastructure analysis to my organization? Well, there's a number of different reasons. First and foremost, I mentioned this before, where it doesn't always have to be a reactive state. Security doesn't have to be that, where I'm dealing and reacting to a potentially malicious attack or a breach on my network. Instead, I can use this concept, this methodology, to proactively identify threats. And so we can identify related infrastructure. We can potentially uncover overlaps in targeting using the methodology that we explained here, and even some of the examples that we've already gone over.
So I can look to see any domains that might appear to be spelled like mine, or have the same, like a subdomain to somebody else, but my name is associated with it. That might be an indicator that something might be starting.
Yeah, like you don't have to wait until you're dealing with an attack. And in fact, you shouldn't.
Right.
You should take that proactive step to basically go and start hunting down threats that may occur against your organization. And one of those ways is looking for your brand inside of infrastructure. Another one of those ways could be simply taking open source intelligence that's being produced on a regular basis from these security companies, looking at the indicators of compromise that they've produced, and fanning out using this methodology on top of that data in order to find more information. And then you can then go take all of that data, block it inside of your network. You don't have to deal with that threat now.
Or even looking internal from the outside to say, how do I appear on the internet? Am I running any infrastructure that might be susceptible to an attack?
Yeah.
Or a 0-day that was just announced, to look to say, do I have any of that infrastructure myself that I might need to shore up?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. That we talk commonly about finding attacker infrastructure, but there's no reason why you can't apply the concept of threat infrastructure analysis, or maybe just infrastructure analysis, to yourself and identify all of the different assets that you have existing externally facing online. So beyond doing the proactive aspect of this as well, you have the ability to assess a potential threat. And so what we mean by that is, RiskIQ has been collecting this data since 2009. So we have an extensive amount of history. And what we're looking for when we're dealing with attackers is something called TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures that they may be employing for their attack. And so to give an example of assessing a threat, a less sophisticated actor may choose to register a domain with their personal email address and their phone number, and they're not going to privacy protect that information, and they're going to continue to use the same IP address over and over again to conduct their attack. Whereas a more sophisticated actor may actually go out and compromise someone else's infrastructure, use a third-party domain, put it on top of that compromised infrastructure, and launch their attack from there. So they're not revealing anything. They're not leaking any, data about themselves. Whereas the other one has leaked a whole bunch of information to us. And so by analyzing the data and the historical information that we have available to us, we can start to measure the potential sophistication of an adversary. How long have they been around? How often have they been employing these techniques? Have they advanced? Have they gotten worse? Have they gotten better? And so on.
Wonderful.
And then lastly, what I love about this process, and it speaks to the point that you raised of turning it in on yourself. We mentioned before about collecting data, that being extremely important. What I like about this process is that you can identify gaps within your own organization. If you're going through and you're kind of conducting these investigations using the external data that we have, you should at the same time be asking, do I have the ability to pull in this NetFlow data? Can I put my own version of a passive DNS sensor on my network? How are we managing our own who-is information? Are we leaking out data that actors could use to find all of our assets?
Right.
And so to me, what's most important here is, yes, you can be proactive. Yeah, you can assess the threats that are coming after you. But more importantly, you want to identify the gaps in your own collection and make sure that you have the appropriate logging, that you have the appropriate devices and the appropriate oversight of all the information on your network. Because like we said before, if you're breached, the external data would be helpful, but it's not anything like having the internal.
And if you don't have that information, then you're blind. You can't make a decision. You don't know what's happened. You don't know the extent or if you've eradicated it.
Yeah, I think one of the nice statistics that's often cited in the one of the Verizon breach reports that they do every year is that it takes upwards of 6 months, I think 180 days before someone actually identifies that they've been compromised. 180 days is a long period of time. If you don't have logs being collected, and you might be dealing with a breach today, but your investigation is going to be informed by all the information you have. And if you don't have that information, you may not know how long the actors have been inside your network.
Or you're not retaining that data. If you're just overriding the logs, you're going to lose it as well.
Yeah, so it's really important that beyond the external threat concepts and using the methodology to certainly surface and assess threat actors, you really want to be assessing yourself at the same time in your organization and ensuring that you have the appropriate level of maturity on your collection as well. So from Benjamin and myself, thank you very much for attending the Threat Hunting Workshop video course that we created. We hope that you got a lot out of it. If you're interested in knowing more about RiskIQ services or you have questions about our particular products, you can reach us at sales@riskiq.net or on our phone number
at 1-888-415-4447 or join our community at community.riskiq.com.
And it's a free service, so regardless of whether or not you've paid us or you're an enterprise user, you can register for the community edition for free and leverage everything that you saw today in terms of exercises and the methodologies that we explained. And we really encourage you to do so. Invite your friends, tell your coworkers about it, and hopefully that'll accelerate your investigations.
Thank you.
Thank you.